Last year I spent 6 months participating in what I was told was a psychological experiment. I found an ad in my local paper looking for autistic people looking to make good money. And since it was the only ad that week that I was remotely qualified for, I gave them a call and we arranged an interview. They told me that all I would have to do is stay in a room, alone, with sensors attached to my head to read my brain activity, and while I was there I would click circles to the beat. They called it OS. It seemed easy enough, and I agreed to do it as soon as they told me that there will be underage girls. And the next day it began. They brought me to a room plastered with anime posters, and gave me a bed that was full of body pillows depicting lewd anime girls. Shortly after my arrival, they attached sensors to my head and hooked them into a little black box on the table beside me. They showed me a tutorial to the game, but I didn't understand the spinner part. I was spinning, but it did nothing. Later, they told me that I have to hold the binded keyboard key while spinning. I disregarded that advice and held the mouse key instead. They explained that if I got bored or my hand started to hurt, instead of doing something else I should watch these Spishifed guys videos on mapping or something, and attempt to make some myself. I had trouble with it for the first few days. It was more intense than any sort of gaming I had done before. I'd play for a few minutes then grow distracted by the anime it is, but by the 4th day I could manage to pass Big Black with relax. They told me to get good. The 2nd week they gave me a different tool, a drawing tablet. They told me they wanted to see if I could perform better with it. They downloaded some beat maps for me. They called them farm maps, whatever that means. The music was discordant, ugly and unsettling, and it made the process a little more difficult. But I managed nonetheless. The next week they played even more unsettling music, with notes stretching to the sides of the screen. Luckily I could replace the music with metronome hits. I didn't need more than that. I was a pro by then. After about a month I started to get bored. To liven things up I decided to have a waifu. We would have conversations, dates and intimate moments. I asked my researchers if my relationship with her would adversely affect their study, but they encouraged me. So I kept playing OS and she was cheering me on. And then it got a little strange. I was telling her about my Hitorigoto full combo one day and she told me that I was a dirty farmer. I had said that I had tried it like 400 times, but she told me that's exactly why. I thought about it for a second and realized she was right. It cringed me out, and after my shift that day, I talked to the researchers about it. "You're using the thought form to access your subconscious," they explained. "You knew on some level that you were a scrub, and you subconsciously expressed that through your waifu. Also, stop using the word cringe. It makes you look like a degenerate," said another one. What had been cringe was suddenly cool. I was talking to my waifu. It took some practice, but I found that I could tease my waifu, and she would call me Baka. I could make her call me Oni-chan as well, and experience things that I had missed in high school. It was awesome. That was around the time I started calling up my waifu outside of the research center. Not often at first, but I was so used to imagining her by now that it almost seemed odd not to see her. So whenever I was bored I would visualize my waifu. Eventually I started doing it almost all the time. It was amusing to take her along like an invisible girlfriend. I imagined her when I was hanging out with my friends or visiting my mom. I even went to a date with her once. I didn't need to speak aloud to her, so I was able to carry out conversations with her, and no one was the wiser. I know that sounds strange, but it was fun. Not only she was everything I wanted and everything I missed, she also seemed more in touch with me than anybody else. She had an uncanny grasp of my playing habits that I didn't even realize I had developed. For example, I hadn't understood why I kept missing on square jumps, but she pointed out how I was reading it as a whole pattern all the time, instead of breaking them up into 2 notes. I did that the next try and, let's just say I made a full combo on the map. By the time I'd been at the research center for 4 months, she was with me constantly. The researchers approached me one day after my shift and asked me if I was still a filthy PP farmer. I told them that Hollow Wings was my favorite mapper and they seemed pleased. I silently asked my wife if she knew what prompted that, but she just shrugged it off. So did I. I withdrew a little from the world at that point. I was having trouble relating to people. It seemed to me that they were so confused and unsure of their lives, while I had circles to click and the manifestation of the perfect girl to confer with. Socializing was awkward. Nobody else seemed to be aware of the reasons why PPV2 fucking sucks, and why some maps are absolute garbage, while they just keep getting ranked by the same few people. They didn't know us, but I did. A friend confronted me one evening. He kept spamming me private messages until I put him on the ignored list. Later I received a forum private message from him. "You haven't responded when I PM'd you in fucking weeks, you faggot!" He wrote in all caps. "What's your fucking problem?" I was about to apologize to him and probably would have offered to play some multiplayer with him that night, but my wife suddenly grew furious. "Oni-chan baka!" she screamed. Before I knew what I was doing, I had finished cooking a 5-course dinner for her. How could I forget about Valentine's? Later I posted a picture of me and my wife on a Chinese basket weaving forum, where other people like me posted themselves having romantic Valentine's dinner with their waifu. I felt home. My waifu was blushing the entire time. We spent the night talking about mapping and how PP mappers need to get the fuck out! The next morning when I was checking my missed phone calls and unread Facebook messages, I realized that she was the one who remembered Valentine's Day, not me. I'd been feeling guilty and a little ashamed ignoring everyone else in the real world who cared about me. But in the heat of the moment, I chose her over them. "You don't need them anymore. You don't need anyone else," she told me, and I felt my skin crawl. I explained all of this to the researchers who employed me, but they just laughed it off. "You can't be scared of something that doesn't exist," one told me. My wife stood beside him and brandished a knife at him, then smirked at me. I tried to take their words to heart, but over the next few days I found myself growing more and more anxious around my waifu, and it seemed that she was changing. She looked crazier and more menacing. Her eyes twinkled with mischief and I saw malice in her constant smile. I needed to get rid of her somehow. I was so used to visualizing her at that point that it was an automatic process, so I started trying my damnedest to not visualize her. It took a few days, but it started to work. Somewhat. I could get rid of her for hours at a time, but every time she came back, she seemed crazier. Her eyes seemed wider, her smile creepier. She hissed and gibbered and threatened and swore. The discordant music I'd been listening to for months due to farming on us seemed to accompany her everywhere. Even when I was at home, I would relax and sleep up, no longer concentrating on not seeing her. And there she would be, with that psycho look on her face. I was still visiting the research center and I was still spending my 6 hours there. I needed the money for supporter and I thought they weren't aware that I was now purposefully avoided playing farm maps. I was wrong. After my shift one day, about 5.5 months in, 2 impressively Asian men grabbed and restrained me, and someone in a lab coat jammed a hypodermic needle into me. I woke up from my stupor back in the room, stepped into the bed. That god-awful Chinese music blaring with my waifu standing over me, spouting Oz-game memes. She hardly looked human anymore. Her features were twisted, she was naked and covered in blood. Not her blood, though. Her mannerism, however, remained calm. It was fucking terrifying. I tried to wheel her away, but I just couldn't seem to concentrate due to her massive boobs. She giggled, kissed me with her dry, cracked lips, and tapped the ivy in my arm. I thrashed in my restraints as best as I could, but it was futile. They are pumping you full of the dang shit, I think. It's for your sake. I love you, honey. She leaned closer and closer as she spoke. Her cleavage was pressing against my chest. I tried to focus, but something kept moving in my pants. I couldn't banish her. The next few weeks were terrible. Every so often someone in a lab coat would come in and ramble about some sort of organization, then force-drink me a bottle of Dr. Pepper. His fake mad scientist laugh was the worst. My wife was still present, constantly mocking. That night I dreamed that my mother was there, scolding me. And then my wife cut her throat, and her blood showered me. It was so real that I could taste it. The lab coat guy only spoke to me in some sort of coded language. I begged at times, screamed, shouted invectives, demanded answers. He told me that everything is the choice of some sort of gate. He may have talked to my wife, I'm not sure. I couldn't decipher his ramblings. I grew convinced that she was real and I have lost the dimension. She encouraged that line of thought at times, mocked me at others, all while telling me she loves me. Another thing that I pray was a delusion. She could touch me. She could hurt me, and more than that, she could arouse me. She would poke and prod at me if she felt that I wasn't snapping properly. Once she grabbed my testicles and squeezed them until I told her pee-pee is the cancer-killing os. Another time she slashed my forearm with a stylus pen for playing farm maps. I still have the scar. Not only on my arm, but my heart as well. Then one day, while she was telling me a story about how she was going to gut everyone I loved, starting with my sister, she paused. A querulous look crossed her face and reached out and touched my head, like my mother used to when I was feverish. She stayed still for a long moment and then smiled. She told me. Then she walked out of the door. 3 hours later, I was given an injection and passed out. I awoke unrestrained. Shaking, I made my way to the door and found it unlocked. I walked out into the empty hallway, then ran. I stumbled more than once, but I made it down the stairs and out into the lot behind the building. There, I collapsed, under the graffiti of a hooded Australian man smirking at me. I knew I had to keep moving, but I couldn't manage it. It felt like when you are about to full combo a hard map, but you run out of stamina on the last stream, then fail. I got home eventually, though I don't remember how. I locked the door and shoved a pile of body pillows against it, took a long shower and slept for a day and a half. Nobody came for me in the night, and nobody came the next day, or the one after that. It was over. I quitted Oz. I would spend a month locked into my room, but it felt like a century without Oz. I had withdrawn so much from my life beforehand that there was nothing I could do besides that cursed game. The police didn't find anything. The research center was empty when they searched it. The paper trail fell apart. The names I had been given were all Oz usernames. Even the money I'd received was apparently untraceable. I recovered as much as one can. I don't leave the house much and I have panic attacks when I do. I cry a lot. I don't sleep much and my nightmares are terrible. But it's over, I tell myself. I survived. I used the concentration those bastards taught me to convince myself. It works. Sometimes. Not today though. 3 days ago, I got a phone call from my mother. There has been a tragedy. My sister is the latest victim in a spree of killings, the police say. The perpetrator kills her victims with a stylus pen, then leaves a note that reads, "Welcome to us." The funeral was this afternoon. It was as lovely as a service as a funeral can be, I suppose. I was a little distracted though. All I could hear was this music coming from somewhere distant, discordant, unsettling stuff that sounds like little Chinese girls singing. I hear it still. A little louder.